Hi, it's Katrina. Are you ready to dive into the world's strangest unsolved mysteries? We're about to explore places and artifacts that are fascinating and sometimes even terrifying. We'll crack open the case of a 150-year-old murder mystery, a woman preserved for 2,000 years, and the shocking truth about our ancestors. Today's video is packed with bizarre mysteries, so grab a snack, some tea, whatever you want, and let's go. The North Pole is terrifying. If Santa Claus really does have a workshop in the North Pole, it must be underwater. Did you know there isn't a single piece of land in the North Pole? There's nothing but ice floating on the Arctic Ocean. The North Pole is a terrifying place where people get murdered and where sunlight rarely shines. If darkness with a touch of twilight sounds like your cup of tea, you might want to move to the North Pole. The sun dips out for a super long stint, from around September to March. It's the ideal place to be a vampire. If only there were more people around to drink their blood. The North Pole also happens to be home to a murder mystery 150 years old. In 1845, Sir John Franklin led an expedition to its doom in search of the Northwest Passage. 2 ships and 129 men perished. The mystery surrounding their disaster still never totally solved. When Charles Francis Hall learned of what happened to John Franklin and his ships, he was inspired to go on a journey of his own. Professor Russell A. Potter from Rhode Island College said Charles was a deeply eccentric man. He only had a few years of education under his belt and worked as a relatively successful publisher in Cincinnati. Charles was not a seaman or an explorer, but that didn't stop him from following his dream. I'm sure we've all had an obsession grow from an interest, and that's exactly what happened to Charles. His intrigue in Franklin's failed quest spiraled into a personal obsession that drove him to the Arctic himself. In 1860, Charles Hall packed up his bags and headed to the Arctic, telling people he was going to find the survivors of the Franklin expedition. His first journey was only a taste of what was to come. Charles gained passage on a whaler ship called the George Henry. He got as far as Baffin Island, where the boat spent the winter. Charles met with some local Inuit, where he learned it was possible that some members of the Franklin expedition had survived. The survivors may have been living among the natives out in the freezing cold. His first expedition brought him back home in 1862 without recovering any survivors. Then Charles went on another expedition that lasted from 1863 to 1869. His third expedition was the big one. His experience earned him a grant of $50,000 from the U.S. Congress. The catch was that Charles needed to find the North Pole. Sadly, he didn't live long enough to even try. I don't know if you've ever been on a ship in the Arctic with a bunch of sailors, but things can get tense, especially when most of your crew resents you as the captain. Shortly after embarking on their journey, the crew of the USS Polaris split into rival factions. Charles' authority was resented, and soon Charles got sick. He fell extremely ill, suffering from excessive vomiting and delirium. He accused several men on the ship of poisoning him, but before he could find out exactly who had done it, he died on November 8, 1871. Even with Charles dead, the crew tried to track down the North Pole. Nobody on Earth had ever seen the North Pole before, so it was an achievement everyone was eager to have. But the crew of the Polaris ended up getting their ship stuck in ice and were forced to flee for the winter. When the crew went back the next year to try and rip the USS Polaris from its frozen prison, a group of 19 people got stuck on a piece of ice. They floated 1,500 miles over the next 6 months. What horrible experience that must have been. 19 men stuck on an ice floe as it drifted aimlessly for more than 180 days. The only reason they survived was that they had a couple of Inuit hunters with them who were able to secure food for the lost party. Suffice to say, the North Pole is not a friendly place. In 1968, Charles Hall's body was exhumed. Scientists found that he had ingested a massive amount of arsenic right before he died. He was poisoned just as he had thought. The killer is still unknown. The Venu samples. In September of 2023, a NASA probe delivered a small capsule to Earth containing some incredibly valuable material. The materials were gathered from the asteroid known as Venu. You might remember that a few months ago, I talked about how scientists were having a hard time opening the Venu capsule. They literally couldn't get it open. But now they have, and what they have found is incredible. The preliminary analysis has revealed that the tiny flakes of material from the asteroid contain the original ingredients that formed the very solar system we live in. The material contains carbon, nitrogen, and most shocking of all, organic compounds. These are the building blocks of all life forms. Researchers also identified clay minerals and certain types of rock found deep in the Earth's oceans, plus magnesium and sodium phosphate. According to NASA, the magnesium and phosphate suggest the asteroid broke apart from an ancient primitive water planet, a planet completely covered in liquid water. The age of the asteroid is going to shock you. This space rock is 4.5 billion years old. Scientists at NASA believe it was created at around the same time that our solar system was born. Something big and heavy may have hit a water planet, dislodging a chunk of the seabed and sending it hurtling through space as debris. And did I mention that its elemental composition is close to that of the sun? This might not seem like the biggest news ever, but it's positively huge. The pieces of Venu make up the largest reservoir of unaltered asteroid material on the planet right now. But what does that mean for us? For the theory of evolution and for the creation of all life in the universe? The simple fact is that Venu has every ingredient necessary to jumpstart life on a habitable planet. I'd say things are looking pretty good for people who believe that alien life is out there somewhere. And now for number 7. But first, it's shout-out time. I want to give a huge thank you to Clover Green and the Stormy for supporting this channel. We wouldn't be here without you. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. The Copper Scrolls Lost Treasure. Out of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is one that is more mysterious than all the others. It's known as the Copper Scroll, and it is way different than the other scrolls found in the caves of the Dead Sea. It's different in every way, from its author to their style of writing, its language, its content, the script itself. It's an anomaly that could one day lead scientists on an Indiana Jones type of treasure hunt. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found by local Bedouins in Qumran. The Copper Scroll was not. It was recovered in March of 1952 in the back of a cave by an archaeologist. 15 scrolls had been found in the cave already, and this was the last one recovered. The other scrolls in the cave were written on parchment and papyrus. This one was written on metal. It's an actual scroll of copper mixed with about 1% tin. Unrolling copper is hard enough when it isn't 2,000 years old. There was no way archaeologists were unrolling this scroll using conventional methods. It took 3 years for them to figure out how to open it. In 1955, they finally agreed to cut the scroll into 23 strips, then put it back together. It was like trying to put a document back together after it was sent through the shredder. The first thing that struck the archaeologists as odd was the scroll's language. It was a different type of Hebrew than the language found on the other Dead Sea Scrolls. It also wasn't a literary work. The supervisor at the opening of the scroll, John Marco Allegro, recognized it immediately as a list. The Copper Scroll contains the directions to 64 locations. It lists 64 places where an insane amount of treasure can be found. Gold and silver in the tons, more than $1 billion worth of riches scattered in where? Nobody has ever been able to make sense of the directions on the scroll. Let me give you some of the directions just so you can understand how confusing the instructions are. But if you do make sense of the instructions and find yourself a few tons of gold, send me a DM. The Copper Scroll claims that one treasure lies under the stairs in the salt pit. Another passage says 65 bars of gold lie on the 3rd terrace in the cave of the old washer's house. Pretty vague, right? You see what I mean. Yet another part of the list says silver is enclosed in wooden vessels that are in the cistern of a burial chamber in Mattia's courtyard. If that's too confusing, maybe you can find the 6 silver bars at the sharp edge of the rock which is under the eastern wall in the cistern. Of course, you didn't think to look at the sharp edge of the rock, did you? The instructions are nonsensical, but for good reason. The places listed likely haven't existed for centuries. Who in the world is Mattia, and where is the courtyard? The scroll dates to about 25 AD, around the exact same time that Jesus was born. The landscape has changed a lot since then. Scholars think the scroll is listing treasure from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The Jewish officials at the temple may have moved tons of gold and silver before the Romans arrived to steal it all. I mean, if I knew the Romans were coming, I would hide my treasure too. In 1962, John Allegro led a treasure hunt in search of the lost gold and silver. His team excavated a few burial places where they hoped to find solid gold bars, but they didn't find squat. Not even a fleck of gold. Even though the information on the copper scroll is publicly available and has been for decades, nobody has found a single thing yet. And if they did, they are keeping it to themselves. The Impossible Codex. The legendary Rohank Codex is 448 pages of impossible text, the words written in an unknown language, and the images downright confusing. Trying to understand what this book says is like staring straight into a strobe light. You're just not going to get anywhere, and your brain might explode. The book was discovered inside the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in the 19th century. It's a little strange because most ancient books are found in caves and tombs, but this one was already in a library. When researchers realized they were dealing with an indecipherable codex, they started looking through the records. That was when they found a clue as to the book's origin. It was donated to the Academy in the year 1838. The donor was a wealthy count named Gustav Batthyány. The book came from his estate in the Hungarian city of Rohank. Nobody noticed it in the 1830s because the count had donated 30,000 other books with it. The codex came from a town so old it doesn't even exist anymore. The town of Rohank has since changed its name to Rechnitz and is currently within the Austrian borders. People like to dismiss the Rohank Codex as a hoax, but if that's true, then it wasn't a very well organized hoax. The codex went unnoticed for years, suggesting it was an honest mistake that it got included in the donated books. But just what exactly is on its pages? The answer to that question is too many symbols. It doesn't make any logical sense. There are around 800 symbols in the book, more than 10 times the number of symbols in any known alphabet. Almost none of the symbols are repeated, which has led experts to believe the codex isn't even written in a language. The symbols could be part of a code so baffling that not even modern computers can crack it. Then there are the bizarre images, the dozens of illustrations of religious and military scenes. The book contains some pictures that look Christian, some that look Muslim, and others that are obviously pagan. It also has symbols of the swastika, the cross, and the crescent all mixed together. The 90 pages of illustrations and the 800 random characters have made the book impossible to understand. Despite years of research, the only thing that scientists have learned is that the codex was written on Venetian paper sometime in the 16th century. But just wait a second, because that doesn't mean much. The codex could have been copied in the 16th century from a much earlier text. It's kind of like how there is no original Bible. There aren't any raw copies of the Gospels, only copies made from the originals. The Rohank Codex could be a similar situation, something copied from a text thousands of years old. This book could contain all kinds of secret knowledge, if only it could be translated. The Immortal Chinese Mummy. Most of us won't look very good in 2,200 years. Whatever you do, please don't exhume me and put me in a museum 2 millennia from now. But there is one woman who looks surprisingly good for having died 200 years before Christ. When archaeologists found her mummy, they were shocked. It was like finding Sleeping Beauty. She is the Immortal Chinese Mummy, known either as Xin Zhui or Lady Dai. She was a member of Chinese nobility during the beginning of the Han Dynasty, around 206 BC. All these years later, and she still has a full head of hair. Her hair is soft, not rough like most mummies. Her ligaments still bend, making her the oldest spry woman on the planet. She is considered the best preserved human mummy anywhere, and she was found by accident. Workers digging an air raid shelter in 1971 stumbled upon her tomb unexpectedly. Her crypt contained more than 1,000 artifacts, including stuff she might have wanted in the afterlife. Archaeologists found makeup, toiletries, and 162 carved wooden figurines. The figurines were representations of her staff, which maybe she was hoping would show up in the afterlife to do her bidding. While Lady Di does look good for her age, especially compared to most mummies, I don't think she would get a lot of right swipes. Take a look at her face here and let me know what you think. Sure, she still has her skin, her nose, her ears, and a gorgeous head of hair, but is that the face of a woman you'd take to the movies on Saturday night? If not, what about this? Here is what Shinjui looked like before her death. It's a recreation, but scientists think it's very accurate. Now she looks a bit more like Sleeping Beauty. Lady Di supposedly looked a lot more like her recreation when she was initially exhumed from her grave. But the moment oxygen touched her body, she began to deteriorate. That was what resulted in her face getting all puffy, giving her more of a zombie vibe. Still, experts are struggling to understand how Lady Di achieved what every ancient Egyptian embalmer strived so hard to do. After she was found, scientists conducted an autopsy. They confirmed that she died in 163 BC. However, they also found that her body was in the exact same shape as someone who had died recently. The medical scientists were able to identify her blood as type A. They also found clots in her blood, showing she died of a heart attack. She had gallstones, high cholesterol, and liver disease. Inside her stomach were 138 undigested melon seeds. She likely ate a bunch of melon seeds only minutes before the heart attack struck. But what about the preservation? The best guess archaeologists have is that the airtight tomb she was sealed in worked kind of like a Ziploc bag, or more accurately, like a bunch of Ziploc containers. Shinjui was placed inside a small pine box coffin. Then her coffin was placed inside a slightly bigger pine box coffin, followed by a slightly bigger one, and then an even bigger one. She was like a nesting doll inside 4 coffins. Shinjui was also wrapped in 20 layers of silk, her body suspended in 21 gallons of an unknown liquid. I don't know who packaged Lady Di, but it was a job well done. I think there's a certain company out there that could learn a thing or two about secure packing. On the floor of her tomb was a thick layer of paste-like soil. There was special charcoal lining the tomb as well for absorbing moisture. Then it was sealed with clay to keep oxygen and bacteria out of the chamber. Whoever buried this woman knew exactly what they were doing to keep her body perfect. But how? And what about the mystery liquid in her coffin? Scientists don't even know what it was, only that it contained traces of magnesium. I'm sure if they discover the formula, it will be worth a fortune. Kedwin, the sorceress. In the ancient world, did magic exist? Scientists don't think so, but what about you? What about tales of sorcerers and magicians, like Kedwin from Welsh mythology? She was a mother, a sorceress, and is now revered by modern practitioners of paganism as a goddess. Kedwin had 1 daughter and 1 son. Her daughter was beautiful, but her son was as ugly as a toad. It wasn't a matter of opinion. He was, as a fact, hideously ugly. Kedwin felt so bad for her son that she tried to cure his ugliness the only way she knew how, through magic. In her cauldron, she brewed a special concoction that would make her son handsome instead of looking like he was beaten by an ugly stick. It was a very complicated potion to make and required a full year of boiling. Who has time to stir a pot for a year? Kedwin hired a young boy named Gwyn to stir the boiling potion for her when she wasn't around. But one day, he took a sip of the potion, rendering it useless. Kedwin was so mad that she turned him into a piece of corn, and her son remained ugly for the rest of his life. It's a weird story, but it's also 2,000 years old or more. Some historians think the ancient myth of Kedwin heavily influenced later stories of King Arthur and the Holy Grail. She was the Wizard of Wales even before Merlin came into the picture. But did she exist? And could ancient people really concoct spells as easily as you might make a stew? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The shocking truth of Pumapunku. Pumapunku is one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in South America. The stonework here defies logical explanation. Nobody can figure out if the ancients used lasers, concrete forms, or some other sophisticated technology they shouldn't have had in the first place. Pumapunku isn't any ordinary ruin. It is the fragmented remains of a massive holy site in Bolivia. The huge stone blocks are scattered across a desert plateau in the Andes Mountains more than 12,000 feet above sea level. Pumapunku is inside the borders of the ancient city of Tiwanaku. It was at this place where the Inca believed the world was created. Looking at Pumapunku today, it's hard to make sense of what you're seeing. There are giant square, rectangular, and 8-shaped blocks everywhere. lying around like somebody smashed a huge Lego castle. All of these stone building blocks are weird because it doesn't look like they were ever part of anything. There aren't any huge structures, pyramids, or towers at Pumapunku, although there are a few walls and gateways. Mostly, though, it's huge stone blocks lying around in the dirt. The people who built Pumapunku are more than just a little mysterious. They left no written record of themselves behind. In fact, they had no written language that scientists have ever found. The archaeological evidence points to a civilization rising in Tiwanaku around 400 BC, but it took them about 900 years before they developed sophisticated technology. When the culture reached its peak in 400 AD, they had roughly 400,000 people living in the area around Tiwanaku. Their political and religious center was at Pumapunku, but there were also farms, trading centers, and residential areas. The rise of civilization in the mountains of Bolivia is a tale as old as time. Just like so many other ancient cultures, the people of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku disappeared in the blink of an eye. Around the year 1000, decades of drought led to the whole city being abandoned. The culture dissolved as its people fled into the mountains. 500 years later, the Inca showed up. By that time, Pumapunku was already in ruins. The Inca arrived to find rows of huge H-shaped blocks lining the empty streets of Pumapunku as if waiting to be incorporated into a new building project. The H-shaped blocks are still there. What's really astonishing is that the blocks look as if they came off an assembly line. It looks like they were just dropped off by a truck at a construction site. Each block is almost identical, something that suggests prefabrication. And that's not all. The stones look like they were carved using lasers. The 90-degree angles are perfect, the contours unbelievably smooth. The stones here were cut with such precision, many believe advanced technology must have been used. There is a real possibility these aren't even stone blocks. Experts have suggested the Pumapunku blocks are concrete forms. There is even evidence that the stones were held together with copper fasteners, something wildly sophisticated for such an ancient civilization. The man as old as coal. In the 1980s, a man named Ed Conrad started digging in a coal bed in Pennsylvania. What he found would change his perception of humanity for the rest of his life. Over the next 20 years, Ed would spend every breath trying to convince the world that they were being lied to. What Ed Conrad found in that coal bed was a collection of human bones. One of those bones is currently on display at the Greater Hazyton Historical Society. According to the museum, they are the only establishment in the world that has petrified bone that was found between coal veins. If what Ed discovered really was the skeleton of a human, the world should be freaking out right now. The coal seam was around 300 million years old. If a human fossil was trapped inside of it, that means evolution is wrong. It means human beings were on this planet millions of years before mainstream science says they ever evolved. Speaking of mainstream science, the accepted theory is that the Pennsylvania bones are not bones at all. Scientific examination has allegedly found them to be inorganic, meaning they don't belong to a human or any other kind of animal. What Ed found were just rocks that happened to be shaped like bones. That's one theory, but let me tell you another. When Ed Conrad first found these bones, he supposedly took them to the Smithsonian Institution to be analyzed. When Ed told the Smithsonian scientists that he'd found the bones in a coal seam from the Carboniferous period, they refused to test them. The scientists looked at the bones, shrugged, and sent Ed off without a thorough scientific analysis. The Smithsonian researchers didn't want to waste their time on what they assumed were rocks shaped like bones. This is how the story goes anyway. Everyone loves to make the Smithsonian the villain. Ed was very frustrated, as I'm sure you can imagine. He wanted a real scientist to at least confirm or deny what he'd found using real scientific tests. He shouldn't have said anything to begin with, and then they would have tested it, right? So Ed went in search of scientists willing to help him. He found an independent researcher who subjected the bones to high-power magnification. Sure enough, the investigator identified what are known as Haversian canals, very specific features found in all bone material, even in fossilized bones. Which theory do you believe? Did Ed really find proof of a human civilization that existed before the dinosaurs went extinct? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The warrior women of ancient Egypt. For 3,000 years, women living along the banks of the Nile in ancient Egypt enjoyed an equality that even by modern standards is impressive. The sexual equality of ancient Egypt has been such a foreign idea that archaeologists used to dismiss it as fantasy. You can't go anywhere in ancient Egyptian ruins without seeing a portrayal of a queen or a powerful woman. There are scenes of queens crushing those who would oppose them. There are images of women executing prisoners. There are even depictions of ordinary women dressed in battle armor and fighting against invading soldiers. Historians used to believe these scenes were fictional, nothing more than pieces of artistic creativity. But the archaeological evidence has something else to say. There have been plenty of female graves discovered containing weapons. The physical proof shows that women were fearsome warriors in ancient Egypt. This kind of equality was not the standard of the ancient world. Even Egypt's neighbors were shocked by the level of freedom that women experienced. When some ancient scholars visited Egypt, they described in bafflement how women were able to attend markets and participate in the trading. All the while, men stayed at home weaving. Herodotus, the legendary Greek historian, once wrote that the Egyptians reversed the ordinary practices of mankind. The mystery archaeologists want to solve is why the Egyptians were so liberal when it came to human rights. Why did this one society treat humans equally while others did not? Women stood alongside men in every single level of society. It wasn't just queens and warriors. There are documents that show women were able to captain cargo ships. Women even had financial independence. There are surviving contracts that show women received the exact same pay rations as men for performing the same job. There was no pay gap between the sexes, and this was more than 3,000 years ago. Modern society still hasn't caught up to the ancient Egyptians. The mystery might be solved by looking at pre-Christian Egyptian religion. The Egyptians were all about duality, believing the universe could only exist in perfect balance. And to have balance, you needed men and women on the same level. One of the most popular deities was the goddess Mat, a symbol of cosmic harmony. It was believed the pharaohs were enforcing Mat's rules, meaning every king and queen was but a mortal subject of the ultimate goddess. Our hairless human ancestors. When you think about ancient human ancestors, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it a primate-type creature with reddish-brown fur and a face only a mother could love? Perhaps like this, thanks to Dave Einzel Stringer. Or do you imagine a completely hairless creature looking like a mix between a monkey and a mole rat? You might be surprised to find out that our ancient human ancestors were more like naked mole rats than fuzzy monkeys. A new discovery is changing how the world sees those who came before us. 50 years ago, scientists made one of the most important discoveries in scientific history. The bones of an Australopithecus afarensis were found dating to 3.2 million years ago in Ethiopia. Scientists named her Lucy, after the famous Beatles song. Ever since her discovery, scientists have created renderings of Lucy with reddish-brown fur, smart brown eyes, and chalky black skin. Most of what they have said is correct, but not the fur part. Technological advancements in genetic analysis have shown that Lucy wandered around naked. She wasn't what you would call a prehistoric prude. So who is Lucy anyway? Scientists only have about 40% of her skeleton. Still, they know that she walked upright, similar to modern humans. She also had a very small skull, suggesting her brain wasn't very big. Lucy has shown that humans evolved to walk upright before they evolved big brains. In 2016, scientists found that Lucy lived in the trees as well. Even though she could kind of walk, she preferred swinging from branches. Now, scientists have figured out she was naked. But it wasn't just Lucy, it was all of our ancestors. Ancient hominids related to Homo sapiens lost their body fur about 3 million years ago, probably due to numerous factors. Things like lice, parasites, and thermoregulation. Or, in plain terms, it was hot and there were too many bugs. Humans didn't start wearing clothes until about 170,000 years ago. That means that for 2.5 million years, our ancestors were as naked as the day they were born, and maybe a little afraid. That must have been extremely uncomfortable. From now on, when you see images of creatures like Lucy and they look like furry apes, you'll know those images are wrong. Lucy and others of her kind were smooth skins like us. Do you think Venu's chemical composition proves that life could begin on any planet under the right circumstances? Hit that subscribe button and come back soon for more videos on ancient history and the mysteries of life.
Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
Martian life. Hidden organisms found in the Arctic could be similar to life in space. Microbes discovered near the North Pole in Canada, buried in the surface sediment near a place called Lost Hammer Spring, could just provide a blueprint for life forms on Mars. Life forms that could still exist today. This is because the permafrost in Canada's high Arctic is extremely salty, cold, and mostly free of oxygen. It's pretty much the same environment that can be found on Mars. And so, researchers with McGill University took a look at never-before-seen microbes in an attempt to understand alien life. By using the newest and most advanced genomic techniques, researchers demonstrated for the very first time in history that microbes living in an environment just like what we find on Mars can survive. These microbes are tiny, yet flourish by eating and breathing nothing except simple inorganic compounds. The same inorganic compounds that are found on Mars, for example, sulfate, sulfide, and even methane. This discovery near the North Pole is so exciting that samples of the sediments are now being used by the European Space Agency to test the instruments they'll use on their next Mars mission to detect possible life. Basically, proof of alien life has been found just under the North Pole, or at least the feasibility of such a thing. It's given scientists quite a lot of confidence that buried in the Martian soil, there will indeed be life forms. What do you think? Are you ready? Sponge gardens. Scientists recently discovered a surprisingly vibrant ecosystem growing in the Arctic Ocean near the North Pole. This rich and densely populated ecosystem consists of massive sponge gardens discovered near the peaks of long-extinct volcanoes. According to researchers on the vessel Polarstern, the life found here is some of the most basic on the planet and can be found everywhere from shallow tropical reefs to apparently the North Pole. Researchers discovered these fascinating animals by lowering a camera underneath the ice and then taking pictures of what's hiding on the bottom of the Arctic Sea. The pictures revealed sponge gardens, and they even managed to collect some samples. What they found truly shocking after analyzing the samples is that many of these living sponges are 300 years old or more. Scientists were surprised to find such an abundance of life because the environment isn't exactly what you would expect to produce such large life forms. Very little light penetrates the surface of the Arctic ice. There's almost no food, and scientists couldn't even figure out what the sponges were eating. It wasn't until they analyzed the samples that they realized the sea sponges act as microbial symbionts, meaning they feast on old organic matter. In simpler terms, they feed on the remains of animals that died thousands of years ago. These things are like fossil eaters, surviving by munching on the slowly decaying remains of creatures that went extinct thousands of years ago. Record-breaking dive. In the year 1958, a United States submarine became the very first vessel to ever reach the North Pole by traveling underneath the ice of the Arctic. It was on August 3rd, and the submarine also happened to be the very first nuclear submarine ever made. The commander of the USS Nautilus, William Anderson, wrote in his logbook, "Embarked following personage at North Pole, Santa Claus, affiliation, Christmas." While that seems pretty vague, the commander was just celebrating the occasion in a cryptic log in his book. Because, believe it or not, the first under-ice mission to the North Pole had been top secret, a covert op codenamed Operation Sunshine. Yes, it was a big deal for the world of science, but in the 1950s, it was a bigger deal for American pride considering the Cold War. Even President Dwight Eisenhower called it a magnificent achievement and sent his congratulations to the team. Unfortunately, they didn't find any monsters or strange life forms hiding in the North Pole. Instead, they proved the capabilities of nuclear-powered vehicles, because prior to the USS Nautilus, submarines had to surface or extend a snorkel above the water to take air into their engines and to charge their batteries for propulsion. But since they were running off a nuclear reactor, they never needed to go to the surface at all. By the time they reached the North Pole, they had already been underwater for 3 days. They didn't resurface again until they reached Greenland on August 7th. Land of the Gods. Cultures across the world have long believed the North Pole is a place of great magic. Many cultures also believe their ancestors came from the North Pole, and that they had to begin migrating southward because of a great ice deluge 10,000 years ago. In the year 8000 BC, the original inhabitants of the North Pole supposedly traveled into Europe and Asia, built new settlements, and became the people of the world. In fact, there are at least half a dozen mythologies throughout the world that place their most sacred lands at the North Pole. Take the Vikings, for example. In Norse mythology, the land of immortality is at the North Pole. The Celtic myths describe heaven as being a place where the sun shines for 6 months continuously, which sounds quite a bit like the Arctic. The Greeks even called the North Pole Hyperborea, meaning above the north wind, and said it was a place where the sun shined 24 hours a day. The Italia Airship. The Italia was an airship that belonged to the Italian Air Force. Back in the 1920s, airships were all the rage. Since it was such a nightmare to get across places like the Arctic using a boat, scientists figured it would be easier to visit the North Pole in a giant balloon. This semi-rigid airship was designed and piloted by the Italian engineer Umberto Nobile. The expedition began on April 15, 1928. The airship left Milan with 20 people on board and 17,000 pounds of equipment. It took 30 hours to reach Germany, and after a brief rest, they continued on to Norway, then to the North Pole, where they crashed into a sheet of ice. One man died immediately, one died from exposure while waiting for rescue, and 6 crew members went missing because they got trapped in the envelope of the balloon as it floated away, never to be seen again. By the time the rescue operation was said and done in July of the same year, 17 people, including many of the rescuers, were left dead. The Italia was a huge disaster, and the remains of the airship are still missing somewhere in the Arctic. Arctic lightning. Lightning storms in the Arctic are not exactly common. In fact, one of the last things scientists expect to see in the North Pole are bolts of lightning coming out of the sky. This is because lightning is a phenomenon that occurs in warm weather. On a steamy summer in Kansas, you can expect some major lightning. But in the frigid wasteland of the Arctic, that just doesn't happen. At least, it never used to. For almost 2 decades, every lightning strike that happens has been monitored in real time by a special organization called the Worldwide Lightning Location Network. These scientists use a global grid of sensors to gather information on lightning strikes, things like frequency and distribution. The data collected over the past approximately 17 years shows a shocking increase in lightning around the North Pole. Actually, it shows dramatic changes everywhere in the Arctic region above 65 degrees north. According to Robert Halsworth, lead director of the WWLLN, lightning strikes have tripled in the Arctic from between 2010 and 2022. And yes, the lightning was actually detected very close to the North Pole, but only in 2019. It was an incredibly rare occurrence, and one we might see more of as climates continue to shift and the Arctic continues to get warmer. Canadian monster. A graduate student from the University of Manitoba recently discovered the very first genuine and scientifically real monster underneath Canada's Arctic sea ice. Near the North Pole, a beast was found with 8 bristly legs, a translucent body, 1 eye, 2 antennas, and no mouth. If that sounds terrifying, that's because it is. The only good news is that the monster is only 2 millimeters long. If you want to get a good look at this thing, you're going to need a microscope. Aurélie de la Forge didn't go seeking this monster out on purpose. She found it as more of an accident while searching for biodiversity way up in the Arctic. It's actually a type of copepod, a simplistic organism from the Monstruloida family. There are over 160 different types of Monstruloida found in the world's oceans, but this is the only one that lives in Canada's Arctic. De la Forge was studying the taxonomy of small ocean animals for her master's degree, and so she was already familiar with tiny marine creatures. When she was living at an ice camp not far from the North Pole, she was sampling the ocean as part of her thesis regarding plankton blooms under ice. And that was when she discovered the creature. It was a lucky chance, and shows just how much life there really is crawling across just about every surface of the planet. Strange blue lights. In 2019, some extremely strange blue lights were seen hovering above the Arctic Circle, not far from the North Pole. The mysterious blue lights, if NASA is to be believed, had nothing to do with aliens. Still, the lights definitely looked like some kind of bizarre alien phenomenon. It was photographers trying to catch a glimpse of the northern lights that took pictures of the blue, hazy orbs in the sky. About 15 or more of them were found in 2 clear spots in the otherwise empty atmosphere. Chad Blakely, the photographer who captured the amazing images, says he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He literally called it completely out of this world. While these may have looked like the bright blue discharge of some alien vessel, NASA says it actually had to do with a scientific experiment. The Andøya Space Center in Norway launched a pair of rockets that released metallic powder. The powder was released inside the northern lights as part of a way for scientists to investigate the conditions inside the aurora borealis. The metallic powder created a shocking light show, but it also helped researchers to track charged particles in the ionosphere. It's all for scientists to learn as much as they can about the processes which occur at the polar cusp of the Earth, where our magnetic field lines bend to spread across the atmosphere, and where space particles and solar wind meet. The most northern island. Scientists have just discovered the closest piece of land to the North Pole. It's the world's northernmost island, and it was revealed just recently thanks to some shifting pack ice. The discovery came, as so many do, completely by accident. Morten Rasch, head of the Arctic Station Research Facility in Greenland, said he and his team had gone to Udak Island to collect science samples. But after they arrived on the island, which was discovered by the Danish back in 1978, they realized they were at the wrong place. They missed their mark by about 3,000 feet. Of course, the island is incredibly small. It's only about 90 feet across and rises to a height of no more than 9 feet from the surface to the ocean. Still, it is technically the northernmost landmass in the world, which meant those explorers were standing as close as a person could stand on solid land to the North Pole. There could be more islands hidden underneath the Arctic ice, specifically the ice found just above Greenland. They have some of the thickest ice in the world, around 9 feet in the summer. And seeing as how the Danish government is trying to make a territorial claim of the North Pole, they're going to need all the islands they can get. The C47 Crash. In 2005, a team with the Canadian Forces carried out a sovereignty patrol near the North Pole, way up in the remote Canadian Arctic. They operated out of an abandoned weather station by the name of Isaacson, which can be found on Elif Ringnes Island. It was once part of the network of remote Arctic weather stations called JAWS, or Joint Arctic Weather Stations. It was built just after World War II and operated briefly by the United States and Canada. This area has some of the worst weather on the planet, or at least some of the coldest. The team's patrol included an exercise in emergency response simulating an Arctic crash. What makes this so interesting is that they use the wreckage of a U.S. Air Force C-47 as part of their exercise. The wreckage is that of a plane that crashed here in 1949. Over 50 years later, the plane hadn't moved an inch and was still sitting in the middle of the snow, just miles from the North Pole. From what we know, the C-47 was equipped with skis so it could land in the snow, and had originally touched down at the weather station to resupply. But overnight, frost had majorly accumulated on the aircraft. The crew, who weren't used to such harsh conditions, cleared the windshield but didn't clean the ice off the wings or the stabilizer. They then tried to depart using an airstrip only 4,200 feet long, while covered with about 5 inches of snow. Plus, they were reportedly 850 pounds overweight for a total of 28,850 pounds. The plane went airborne, the right wing dipped, and then they crashed into a riverbank. The C-47 got stuck, but luckily the crew escaped. The vehicle was just abandoned, and nobody ever went back for it. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Bye!